history is a liar. It tells you that the Rwandan genocide was a spontaneous eruption of tribal hatred. It tells you that people simply lost their minds. But madness is chaotic. Rwanda was organized. It was a surgical operation performed with machetes. 800,000 lives extinguished in 100 days. That's 330. 3 deaths per hour. 5 deaths per minute. Every single minute for 3 months. To achieve this, you don't need monsters. Monsters are rare. You need neighbors. You need the ordinary man. How do you convince a man that the person who stood as the godfather to his child is actually a cockroach that needs to be crushed? Welcome to Psyche of Power. Today, we perform a psychological autopsy on the Rwandan genocide. This is the anatomy of dehumanization. April 1994, 8:20 p.m. A Falcon 50 jet carrying the Rwandan president is blown out of the sky. Within minutes, before the wreckage was even cold, the radios began to scream, but they didn't scream for peace. They screamed for work. The work was the total liquidation of the Tutsi minority. But the infrastructure of this killing started years before the first shot was fired. It started with the Belgians. They brought calipers and science. They decided that if your nose was thinner and your skin lighter, you were a Hamite, an elite Tutsi. If you were shorter and broader, you were a Hutu peasant. They took a fluid ethnic identity and turned it into a rigid biological hierarchy. This is step 1 of the cockroach protocol, categorization. You cannot kill everyone. You must first name the other. In modern neuroscience, we know the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, is what activates when we think about other humans. But when we view outsiders as disgusting or subhuman, the MPFC stays silent. The brain processes these people not as others, but as objects. Enter the RTLM, the Radio TLA Wissenleiber des Millkaleins, the soundtrack to the apocalypse. They didn't use dry, political speech. They used humor. They used pop music. They used Inienzi. Inienzi, it means cockroach. This wasn't just an insult. It was a psychological trigger. You don't murder a cockroach. You exterminate it. You clean the room. You perform hygiene. This leads us to our first deep dive Jacques-Philippe Leyens' theory of infrahumanization. Leyens argued that we don't always deny the humanity of others entirely. Instead, we deny them secondary emotions. Primary emotions, fear, anger, lust, are shared with animals. Secondary emotions, nostalgia, pride, moral guilt, are what make us human. The Hutu power movement convinced its followers that Tutsis were capable of fear, but not love, capable of pain, but not dignity. When you reduce a human to a biological machine that only reacts to stimulus, killing them becomes no more significant than slaughtering cattle. Between 1993 and 1994, Rwanda, a country with a failing economy, imported over 500,000 machetes, 1 for every 3 Hutu males. But how do you get a farmer to pick one up? You use the most powerful psychological tool in the arsenal, moral disengagement. Psychologist Albert Bandura identified 8 mechanisms humans use to silence their conscience. Rwanda used all of them. Mechanism 1, moral justification. The killers were told they weren't murderers. They were defenders of the revolution. They were told that the Tutsis were planning to enslave them again, like in the colonial days. Kill or be killed. Mechanism to diffusion of responsibility. When everyone is killing, no one is a killer. The mob is a psychological cloak of invisibility. It's the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt described, but with a tribal twist. Here is the first cognitive reversal. You think the killers were evil, but in their own minds, they were the good guys. They felt the same moral satisfaction you feel when you do your taxes or recycle. They were cleaning their community. This is the horror of the human psyche. Our morality is a software that can be hacked and reprogrammed. Now, let's talk about the medium. Why radio? Rwanda is a land of 1,000 hills. Communication is difficult, but radio waves, they are everywhere. Radio is intimate. It's a voice inside your head. It's the ultimate authority in a village where books are rare. For months, the RTLM broadcasted the Hutu 10 Commandments. Commandment 8, Hutus must stop having mercy on the Tutsis. Mercy is a biological instinct. To kill it, you need constant, 24/7 repetition. You need to desensitize the amygdala. This is Pavlovian conditioning on a national scale. Associate Tutsi with pain, threat, and dirt. Second cognitive reversal. The West didn't ignore Rwanda because they didn't know. They ignored it because of institutional dehumanization. To the UN and the US, this wasn't a genocide. It was ancient ethnic friction. In psychology, this is the identifiable victim effect. We will spend millions to save one person whose name we know. But when the victims are othered by race and distance, they become statistics. And statistics don't trigger the helping response. Let's look at the act itself. The machete. A rifle is a distance weapon. You pull a trigger, a piece of metal travels, and the person stops moving. It's clean. A machete is labor. It's intimate. You have to feel the resistance of the bone. You have to hear the breath of the victim. How do you sustain that level of violence for 100 days? Here is our third psychological pillar, the pain of social exclusion. If a Hutu refused to kill, he was called a Tutsi lover. He was excluded. He was next. The brain processes being an outcast as a physical threat to survival. Killing became the entry fee for social belonging. You killed to stay part of the in-group.
Churches.
In Rwanda, people ran to churches for sanctuary. In most genocides, churches are shelters. In Rwanda, they were killing pens. Why? Because the moral disengagement was so complete that the sacred space was redefined as a nest of insects. The genocide ended when the RPF's Tutsi rebels took control, but the psychology didn't end. How do you rebuild a country where the killer lives next door to the survivor? Rwanda used Cockroach, community justice. This is the most unhuman part of the story. The radical, forced forgiveness required to simply survive. Final cognitive reversal today. Rwanda is one of the safest, most developed countries in Africa. They have deleted ethnic labels. It is now illegal to call yourself Hutu or Tutsi. You are only Rwandan. But can you really delete a psychological pathway that led to 800,000 deaths? Or is it just suppressed, waiting for the next radio to play a new song? Look around you today. The tools have changed. The radio is now an algorithm. The language of dehumanization is remarkably consistent. When you see a group of people being called a plague, a cancer, or subhuman on your feed, that is the sound of your MPFC shutting down. That is the Cockroach protocol being downloaded into your brain. We like to think we would have been the rescuers, the Oskar Schindlers. But statistics say you would have been the one with the machete, or the one who watched from the window, because the Lucifer effect isn't about bad apples, it's about a bad barrel. Rwanda wasn't a failure of humanity, it was a triumph of psychology. We say never again, but never again is a hollow slogan if you don't understand how it happened. It happened because of the neighbor's dilemma. It happened because we are wired to belong, and we are wired to exclude. The Rwandan genocide is a mirror. It shows us that the line between citizen and executioner is thinner than a machete's edge. 100 days of darkness, 30 years of memory. The radio in Kigali has been silent for a long time. But the frequency of dehumanization is still broadcasting. Can you hear it? This is Psyche of Power. Stay sharp, stay human. Subscribe if you're brave enough to look into the mirror. See you in the next autopsy.